Again, a very warm welcome to everybody. We have an extremely topical agenda item today for our evidence meeting. The National AI Strategy, how should it look? Well, I think many of us, we had a House of Lords report called No Room for Complacency. The AI Council had their excellent roadmap. And the common conclusion was that there should be a national AI strategy put together to give a kind of longer term 5-year overview of where we should be on AI across a whole range of areas. And lo and behold, and this doesn't happen very often with government, but lo and behold, we had Oliver Dowden announce his 10 tech priorities. And at the same time, he announced that there was going to be a national AI strategy coming out in the autumn. And it was going to focus on the growth of the economy through widespread use of AI technologies, ethical, safe, and trustworthy development of responsible AI, and then resilience in the face of change through an emphasis on skills, talent, and R&D. And unpacking some of those aspects of the AI strategy, I think is what many of us will want to do today. Personally, I think the second aim of ethical, safe and trustworthy development of responsible AI is a very interesting area to unpack because we don't quite know what that means. Does that mean the risk-based type of regulation that is emerging in the EU that's being suggested by the Council of Europe and others? Or is it something short of that? When you look at the growth of the economy, you look at the emphasis on skills, it's very clear that it is not purely a DCMS or an Office for AI solution that's being looked at. We've got the Treasury involvement, of course, with their funding of research. We've got the Department for Education and Skills, who have published their Job for Skills white paper. There's going to be a new bill on skills and employment. Is that going to be sufficient? Is that going to fit easily within the national AI strategy? And what more will we want out of it? And I can't think of a better panel to help us unpack some of those issues. All the people who've been involved heavily in the AI debate and discussion, policy formulation and suggestion over the past few years. So it really has brought together a great group of people. And we're going to give each of them, however great they may be, you only ever get 5 minutes on our all-party group, sadly, because we always like to hear from all our witnesses and then open it up for the rest of our attendees to really get to grips with some of the questions they want to ask and get answers to. But I'm going to start with Roger Taylor, who is the chair of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and who is no stranger to our councils here. Roger, really nice to see you.
Thank you very much for asking me to come and talk today. I'm going to answer 2 of the questions on your list, or address 2 of the questions around what do I think the priorities should be and what would I like to see in it that perhaps hasn't necessarily been missing, but hasn't given the prominence that I would like to see in the forthcoming strategy. The first thing to say is I think the AI Council's roadmap gets it exactly right in terms of what are the specific things government can do here. It's investment in research and development, it's skills development, it's data infrastructure and mechanisms to ensure trustworthy use of AI and international engagement. So I completely support that framing of it. The things that I would really like to see in it, it's not always easy, but the thing I would really like to see is some objectives around much in the way that there was with the Grand Challenge, but being rather more specific about objectives that we wish to achieve through AI that the public would welcome. I think one of the problems we sometimes have in building public trust is we use these technologies to do things that the public aren't really that keen to be done anyway, or they're suspicious. So I'd really like to see a focus on things such as use of AI to deliver a greener energy grid and reduce CO2 emissions. I would love to see some clear linking of the AI strategy to mechanisms to improve the management of online harms. That's the first point. And then the second point is that I would like to see a really clear ambition for the UK to lead the world in the technologies and practices required to use AI safely. And in particular, I'm thinking there of data sharing mechanisms and data stewardship mechanisms, because data is the fuel that drives the whole thing. It is essential both to innovate, and also secure access to data is necessary to regulate, or to at least audit and to understand how AI systems are operating. So that's the first thing I'd pull out. Second thing I'd pull out would be particularly auditing. Auditing is still a nascent field and growing rapidly, and one where the UK has huge potential to lead the world. And the reason I mention that I would like to see both these things in an AI strategy is that I do not believe you can address the questions of ethical use of AI in the abstract. We are still finding our way here. And to your point about the EU approach, I do think there's real risks about trying to create horizontal overarching regulators for AI at a point when the harms tend to be very specific to the context in which they are used, and effective management of those risks requires deep domain knowledge of the particular areas. But the technologies we need, the systems in terms of how we look after data and how we audit systems, will be, I think, huge industries across the world, and they will operate across different domains, so that it is only by setting ourselves clear objectives for beneficial things that we can do with AI and using those projects to define what good governance looks like that I think we will get to the right answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. You've kind of packed in a marvelous amount of kind of experience and knowledge into that very short overview. But I wanted just to ask you a little bit, because obviously the conclusion many of us drew from the AI barometer was that there were areas that required a degree of regulation. You might argue, where the cutoff point arises, but it wasn't just a question of ethics. It was necessarily, in certain areas, a question of regulation. I mean, is that the kind of discussion that you think the AI strategy should have, as well as the other, what you might describe as more positive aspects of AI strategy?
Yes, and apologies, I obviously didn't make myself clear at all. I think what we are talking about when we talk about data stewardship arrangements and we talk about AI auditing, these are the mechanisms of regulation. Yep. They are also the mechanism by which organizations can take responsibility for themselves. But I have no doubt that these mechanisms will have to be hard-coded into tough regulation, whether that's Ofcom regulating online media, whether it's the FCA regulating the financial services sector. But we need to there's a huge amount of work to do to really understand how you audit these things effectively. The CDEI has been working with academics and others on developing approaches to audit, and we have a long way to go. We can talk about these ideas in the abstract, but until you get down to the specific use case and you start to understand, well, where do we think the harms are and how do we identify them, that we can ensure that we know what we need to do, and secondly, make sure that the regulations are written in the right way, which on the whole they are, but more importantly, perhaps, the regulators have the skills and the competency to be able to hold organizations to account for what they're doing. Yes,
and of course, members of your team at the CDEI wrote a very good chapter on precisely this in the Council of Europe feasibility study about the tools needed for compliance and so on. Great, thank you very much indeed. And then on to Andrew Straight.
Thanks so much for having me here. And I just want to start by saying I completely agree with all the points that Roger has just made. One of the things I think we often start with when thinking about the AI strategy is, what are we trying to do with AI? the goal of the strategy is not just to have more AI for the sake of AI. It's to accomplish certain positive goals or certain particular positive vision for the world that we'd like to see. So when I think about what we would like to see out of an AI strategy, I think there would be a few things that come to mind. First would be an articulation of some kind of values that AI can enable or that AI reflects. The Scottish National AI Strategy does do this. It lists values like fairness or creating a more just society as core values that it hopes to see. I think there's also a notion that Roger touched on, of grand challenges, very specific applications that we can see AI contributing to and articulating a very positive vision for how to use this technology in a very thoughtful and socially beneficial way. And that also makes regulation of those uses, I think, a bit easier. You have some very clear ways where you can articulate regulatory priorities if you have grand challenges in mind. A core challenge, and something we've identified through a series of workshops we've been running on this exact question, what should the AI strategy reflect when it comes to governance and regulation, is how do you set those national priorities, those grand challenges? I think Roger's exactly right that points around like decarbonization and climate change are ones that I think many of us can agree on. But of course, there comes a challenge with AI's application there, that there are many questions about whether AI contributes to carbon footprint at a rate that exceeds the benefit it might have. And I wonder what those other types of challenges would be and what methods we can use to identify them. So one thing that I think we come up against quite a bit in our work is this notion of more participatory forms of engaging in policy and engaging in technology. I think data trusts, as Roger mentioned, and data cooperatives are fantastic ways to create more participatory forms of data governance, more democratic forms in which individuals can have more say over how their data is used. Well, I would wonder if we could also do something in that vein when it comes to the values and the priorities that the National AI Strategy would have. How can we hear from different members of society who are affected by these technologies to articulate that sort of ideal vision of the world we want to create with AI? The last thing I'll end on was this point around auditing and impact that Roger picked up on, which I think is a very good point. You know, when we think about the value of regulation, it is a way to make the UK a leader in safe and effective AI that people can trust and that is trustworthy. I think a similar question comes when it relates to auditing and impact assessment. Who gets to define what a harm is? The harms that are articulated by a developer of a system may be very different by the employees who are affected by that system or by the other individuals in society who are affected by it. So again, I think there is a need for more participatory forms of technology development and governance and for regulation in order to help answer those questions. I'll end with my time there. Thanks.
Andrew, thank you. I mean, the Ada Lovelace has done some extremely useful papers on, if you like, some of the areas of AI which give rise to concern. And, you know, I'm thinking obviously of live facial recognition, that kind of area. I mean, you've slightly skated around that. You've talked about data governance, and you said that you agreed with what Roger had to say, by which I assume that you agree with this kind of horizontal aspect of regulation. It isn't, sorry, it's a vertical form of regulation with the different regulators, not some cross-sectoral general regulation. But do you think there are certain technologies in certain sectors that are so high risk that you have to make the assumption that they should be regulated, or do you think it's all a matter of degree, and you wouldn't start out with any particular sort of bias in mind in terms of where you would start wanting to see some kind of regulation?
That's a very good question. I think on that question of horizontal versus vertical regulation, where we come out currently is that there's a need for a bit of both, but most importantly, if you're going to have horizontal regulation, you need to have capacity. So some kind of way of getting regulators up to speed, resourced to address the kinds of challenges that AI brings. And most importantly, to have disclosure requirements, the ability to audit and assess and have access to the systems. And I think the online safety bill and other bills that are coming before Parliament are fantastic examples of how to do that. On that question of, are there some technologies that are so high risk they should be banned? I don't think we are in a place yet where we can say what specific of those technologies are. I think there are some contexts in which I would personally think we should have a ban on certain types of technologies, but we currently lack the methods or the process for deciding what those are. I think facial recognition being a great example, we have yet to fully study and understand the effects of those technologies on different communities, particularly the over-policed communities in this country. And I think the lack of that involvement and engagement in policymaking makes it very difficult to assess the full range of harms. Live facial recognition is, I think, a very clear one, but there are so many other forms of biometric technology that are currently being used that are not a part of that discussion. Things from emotion recognition to gait recognition to heartbeat recognition. I think it's essential that we have more engagement to understand those types of risks that those different technologies raise and assess the right context where they may be permitted and the ones where they may be prohibited.
That's really interesting. So actually the development of tools for audit, exactly as Roger said, but also I think you were more explicit about impact assessment and so on. That should be actually part of a national AI strategy in itself, or included within the national AI strategy. That's great. Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. And now on to Maria Axente, Responsible AI and AI for Good lead. It's a great job title, if I may say so, Maria, of PwC.
Thank you so much, Tim, and great to be here. Tonight, I would like to talk about one specific group whose rights and unique characteristic I would like to see part of the national strategy, and those are the children. We talk a lot about climate change to leave our children a better planet. We talk a lot about educating and creating the right job for our children, but we don't talk a lot about raising children in the age of AI. In 2018, I wrote an article with the title Rising Children in the Age of AI that went viral, so much so that has inspired World Economic Forum Generation AI program and also UNICEF AI for Children. And since 2008, we've learned a lot about the AI exposure to children. The fact that YouTube or Facebook, although they have created Facebook for children and YouTube for children, soon after their release, they acknowledged that most of the children will be on the big platform. Nevertheless, children are exposed to AI much more than traditional for children application like toys, education resources, or social media, where they tend to spend quite a lot of time, but also increasingly and emerging use cases like public spaces, health, leisure time, and entertainment, where the children come in contact with AI-powered technologies. So much so that voice assistants or AI toys or facial recognition technologies can be very easily weaponized for our children. When we started looking at what has been done, it was not surprise, not much has been done. When we started working at the policy guidance with the UNICEF group, we've surveyed over 19 different national strategies, and the mention of the children is almost inexistent. And if it is, it's very much crammed under the issues of health, education, and privacy, but not so much in understanding what are the concrete risks and opportunities that AI use in relation to children can exist. And since we have this vacuum, obviously, UNICEF has stepped in to create this policy guidance that has two specific main objectives. One is to raise awareness of those, the need for deeper consideration of the rights and the needs of the children when it comes to developing and using AI. And that this policy allows us to actually understand what are some risk, very hands-on risk when it comes to AI for children, like system and automated discrimination, limitation of development, of children's development, infringement of data privacy, and exacerbation of digital divide, but also some very exciting opportunities like aiding children education and contribute to better health, also contributing to sustainable development goals. And while this guidance provides not only the means for creating this awareness in society, but also provides hands-on tools and recommendation for public policy people, but also for the developers on how to approach developing AI with children in mind. At the moment, the policy guidance is being piloted by the government of Malta and Scotland, but the group is also in conversation with other partners, other governments around the world to do the same. And since we are starting to acknowledge that there is no joke, we are going to deploy technologies that fundamentally change the future, it's time to develop AI with our children in mind. And what's the best place to start than a national AI strategy like the one that we're putting together? Thank you.
That's great, Maria. Thank you. It's such a hot topic, given you know, the online harms bill, online safety bill, I think I should call it now, coming through tomorrow in the Queen's speech and so on. You know, it's very interesting to hear about what you're doing with UNICEF and so on. And of course, Tabitha's, you know, AI roadmap talked about digital literacy, you know, which obviously ties in very closely with this. But what I struggle with is concretely how you actually deliver digital literacy. You know, where do you start? Okay, schools, yes, but you know, an awful lot of teachers are not actually in a position to really impart digital literacy in many respects. You know, sometimes they aren't as familiar with the digital world as the people that they're teaching. So how do you get to grips with this? What concretely would you put in a national AI strategy that would deliver what you want to see delivered?
I think that's an excellent question, and I will start that going back to the conversation we had in APPG before. Is like, how do we start educating the public policy, those that create public policy, and understanding not just how AI should be built, but also how AI is being used. Because I think ultimately most of us will end up being users of AI, or will be stakeholders, direct or indirect, of AI, and we don't know how it's being used, what is being done to us, and what is the impact it has on us and our ability to lead a good life. So I will start probably with public policy, with the civil service servants first of all, and probably then I'll go all the way down to teacher and parents. We talk so much about the impact on AI on children, but when we look at who is best to protect our children, it's us, the parents and the carers. And the reality is, if you ask a parent on the street, the ones that do not afford childcare and they will use the phone to raise their children, they have no idea that, you know, who's behind TikTok, where most of the children, I'm not even saying teens, children are spending awful amount of time. So how can we start giving a little bit of understanding to the parents what happens in the world of digital, how those algorithms ended up shaping, you know, children that are vulnerable because they are early in their development stage, and what measures should be taken so that they find this balancing between how much time children spend online exposed to the self-learning algorithms versus you know, interacting with other humans.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. And now, hot foot from AstraZeneca, we have Jim Weatherall, who's the Vice President of Data Science and AI R&D. And Jim, thank you very much. AstraZeneca is a name that's been on all our lips for some period of time.
Yes, thanks very much, and great to be here. Yes, we do seem to be quite well known these days. So maybe just to set a little bit of context, as the other speakers have done very well, and then to sort of lay out some thoughts and some recommendations. So where am I coming from? We see AI as having a transformative effect on healthcare and life sciences, and it's something we're incredibly interested in as an organisation as well. So AstraZeneca is actually the single largest private investor in R&D in the UK, spending around £1.5 billion annually, just to drop a stat in there. That's to indicate our interest. That said, I'm not here to advertise AZ. I'm rather feel like I'm speaking more on the platform of large business and the healthcare and life sciences sector. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. The three areas that I think we feel is really important in how AI can transform healthcare and things like discovering new medicines, which is what we do, is around infrastructure, skills, and innovation. So I'd just like to say a bit about each of those three in my time. Infrastructure, we think, is incredibly important because, as we've heard, data is the oil or data is the fuel that kind of drives AI. So I think it's really important for that data and technological infrastructure to be strong for AI to do what it needs to do. This, of course, creates a demand for new skills that we're seeing, and we're not always seeing the supply keep up with the demand. And I think in the innovation space, we kind of see that the future of, again, in our case, discovering new medicines, but more broadly, how healthcare systems operate, being driven and the UK differentiating itself in this respect through innovation. So let's get a little bit more specific then. What might I recommend or ask for in each of those three areas? So in terms of infrastructure and data and technology, we would really love to see a very, very close alignment between the national data strategy and the national AI strategy to really recognize that those are sort of two synergistic cylinders that need to pump the engine in a complementary way. We really think there needs to be continued and uplifted investment in the UK data infrastructure, and that we should do this in a way that sort of leverages the UK's unique strengths. So if we think about the unique infrastructure that is the NHS and the data that's collected there, and actually how that's gone through a step change in the last year or so, how can we keep that journey going so that healthcare, life sciences and biomedical data in the UK becomes an internationally renowned asset? Onto the skills side, I think it's really important as we see offerings come through, both in, say, the undergraduate and the postgraduate space, that we start to get that aligned so that across universities, for instance, as an employer, we would know what skills somebody would be coming out of those institutions and to us with, now that there's more and more courses emerging where somebody will come with a degree certificate that says data science on it. I think that's not just for the data scientists. Data literacy is also really important. So for instance, from our point of view, we'd love to see biological sciences students do a data literacy module because, and I'm sure it's not just biologists this applies to, but that's our example, to make sure this interdisciplinary nature of data science and artificial intelligence is brought forward. And finally, I think in a sort of post-Brexit world, making sure that we still have international access to the best available talent. So talent coming from the EU, making sure that it's frictionless as possible for them to come in and work for us, or indeed transfer within our company to the UK. And finally, again, on these three, infrastructure, skills and innovation, what might I suggest on innovation? I think it's, again, continuing to see investment in both fundamental and applied data science. And where we see the real opportunities is at those interfaces, big companies, small companies and startups, academic and public sector, and really ensuring there's enough engagement, funding and mechanisms at the interfaces of those to allow things like spin-outs from universities, spin-ins to companies, and really engendering the innovation at the interface of all these different organizations. So a few quick fire thoughts there, and thanks again.
That's great, Jim. Thank you very much. And I would have added the word catapults as well at the end on your, because I think the commercialization aspect is important. But let me ask you a very different question, because you talked about internationally renowned sort of user of data, if you like, and the national data strategy and how it fits with the national AI strategy. Now, the national data strategy may well come before, or the response, if you like, to the consultation may come before the national AI strategy. But there is an issue of trust here. And, you know, there's quite a lot of public discussion about the use of data, particularly health data. How do you, I mean, this impacts on AI strategy to quite a large degree. And it's a real problem because, you know, for instance, the trade deals that have been struck, it's not at all clear that we aren't kind of opening up in a way that is actually not completely transparent access to data sets and so on. and particularly health data is sensitive in that respect. So how do you gain public trust so you can, in a sense, innovate and use data and so on in the positive way that you're suggesting?
Yeah, great question. And of course, without that, the rest of this value doesn't get unlocked. I think it also reminds me of a question I saw already in the chat about, data sharing from individuals or hubs or data owners or something. So, but I think for me, the answer to your question is, it is that bigger conversation. I think, unfortunately, there's been a number of false starts in the past where, there's been a group of experts in a room. Then news has leaked out that this group of experts have discussed data type X, and it makes it into the newspapers or whatever. We don't need to give specific examples, but that's where it can go wrong. So how can it go right? I think there has to be a wider, open, public consultation around this. I think there's some tremendous efforts like UPD at the Wellcome Trust, understanding patient data, that really seem to have got their heads around how you engage with the wider public around healthcare data, for instance. And some hubs have started citizens' juries, where you literally get a jury of individuals and say, well, what would you think if I did this with your data? And it sort of leads us to the notion of data trusts, where it's not necessarily the data owners that control, but a data trust is set up in a very transparent way so that who can access it carefully controlled. And again, that's transparent and anybody can find out what those rules are. Not an easy one to crack, but I see some really interesting work in that direction.
That's really interesting. You've got a lot of nods because data trusts have a lot of fans in present company, I think. So that's great, Jim. Thank you very much. And on to Tabitha. Tabitha Goldstaub, who is the co-founder of CogX and chair of the government's AI Council, and corralled her council and produced a fantastic report not that long ago with many of the key areas that are going to be part of the AI strategy, with suggestions for how that should go forward. So I think you may well have the inside track, Tabitha.
Thank you very much, Tim. As you know, the council is on this mission just to make sure the AI council is more than the sum of its parts. The AI ecosystem is more than the sum of its parts. We look to facilitate this open dialogue between stakeholders, and so I really value being here today. Thank you very much. As such, I thought it would be helpful to share the thinking that went into the recommendations we made and where I feel that parliamentarians could focus their attention. As part of this mission to foster more dialogue, in June 2020, which is when all of this started, we saw that the world was slowly thinking beyond the pandemic, and we agreed that the right thing to do would be to set out this collective vision to the government for how AI could be developed in the UK beyond the sector deal. As you've all seen, the roadmap set out the series of signposts and a strategic direction of travel for the government to consider. Hence, where our main recommendations were twofold: double down on what's working, accelerate the best of the investment that's already been made, and secondly, look to the future and write a national AI strategy fit for the next 5 to 10 years. As you alluded to, shortly after the publication, the Secretaries of State of Decent Assemblies agreed that the Office for AI will write this national AI strategy. It will be published later this year, and we've already kicked off the process of helping the Office for AI to dig into the recommendations and convening many one-on-ones and over 10 roundtables already conducted to gather more thoughts from the ecosystem. To that end, I'd like to draw people on the call's attention to the link on the AI Council page on the government's website, so you can sign up to get involved, as I'm already readying to share a survey in the next few weeks. Now, the challenge for the parliamentarians is going to be prioritising. We know the UK starts from a place of strength in research, enterprise and regulation, and with its history of recent support for AI, it stands among the best in the world. But we lack the scale to do everything, which is why we recommend the government's ambition push for scale and reliability in areas of unique advantage and make the hard choices of where to focus. In the roadmap, we pointed to the options for this and laid out 16 recommendations to be considered. Firstly, alongside arguments set out in UKRI's AI review, we stressed the importance of scaling up investment in the fundamental AI research and committing to a 10-year programme of high-level skills building, doubling down on initiatives like the master's conversion, for example, which has been a huge success in adding diverse talent to the workforce. The section on adoption focuses on both increasing buyer capability across all sectors and company sizes, including an emphasis on the public sector, as well as removing barriers for the AI startup vendor community to really thrive. We point out 3 sectors and show how AI could support the NHS to deliver the best healthcare, support the complex challenges of meeting net zero carbon emissions, and keep the country safe and secure. There is, of course, an emphasis on consolidating and accelerating infrastructure and governance needed to increase access to robust, diverse data sets. And we recently published a report with Ada Lovelace looking at data stewardship. Crucially, we believe that none of this is going to be possible at all without the public being able to trust companies using AI. As you've already heard from Andrew, Maria, and Roger, the UK will only feel the full benefits of AI if all parts of society have full confidence in the science and technologies and in the governance and regulation that enable them. That confidence will depend on the existing systems that ensure full accountability, clear ethics, and transparency. This is why, of all the recommendations, the one I'd like to draw your attention to today is about how we include the general public in the future developments of AI. In the roadmap, we suggest an academy for AI to enable more people to lean in and learn about living and working with AI, and as a place to develop a healthy dialogue between people and developers. This is just one solution. There are, of course, various ways to be successful here. I'm currently working on a national TV format, for example, and so I look forward to continuing that dialogue with you and others. Please do head to the AI Council website and sign up if you'd like to lean into this discussion or the many others that are going to be needed in order to ensure the AI ecosystem really flourishes.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. And I must say, I think that general public involvement is so important, because that's one of the things we're all going to have to learn, is how to work and live with AI in the future. But I'm not going to ask you a question about that, because I know that one of the passions that you have is about AI and the diversity of the workforce. And I find that one of the most difficult and intractable areas. It appears very prominently in the roadmap. I hope government pick it up. It's something that we picked up in our original House of Lords report as well. So Stephen and I have a particular interest in this area as well. But you know, how are we going to do this? Is it through things like the conversion courses, which you are so pleased about? Is it by not, in a sense, quote, discriminating against the arts, which we currently are, and actually trying to make sure that we can teach arts and humanities students about AI, so then they can take part in the workforce, because that's where quite a lot of the diversity is going to come from. What do you think the solution is to this?
You have pointed not only to one of the things that I care about the most, but also to a lot of the potential solutions. And I think that what we made really clear in the roadmap is that the government need to commit to this. And therefore that means tracking, and that means benchmarking. That means making sure that every single initiative is seen in the round. So rather than seeing diversity initiatives as like one of many, it is included in all initiatives. As Dame Wendy Hall says, if it's not diverse, it's not ethical. You know, if it's not diverse, it's not good. It's not good for the economy. We have to see this as a financial as well as ethical, both of those two things, which will drive every decision that's made. So some of the initiatives you just described, they must happen, but every initiative needs to be seen like this in order for the dial to actually really be moved.
Great. Thank you very much, Tabitha. And our final speaker is Dr. Stephen Croft, the Bishop of Oxford, who is a founding board member of the CDEI and one of the esteemed colleagues that I had both on the original House of Lords Select Committee report and our follow-up report as well. So he's shared the agony all the way through. Stephen.
Thank you, Tim, and really good to hear the other speakers and to listen to this conversation as a non-specialist, which is something I've been doing for the last 4 years now, and acquiring an awareness over the years, I suppose, of the complexity. What I've tried to do for this afternoon, I'm just going to share a PowerPoint. I've tried to distill what I think are the 5 key ethical questions for this strategy. Ethics has become, for me, over the last 4 years, in this area, a more complex field than I thought it was. And I'm still learning about it, but I wanted to bring that thinking together into a bit of a map And if I could, I wanted to get something that would fit on a credit card for parliamentarians as questions that they should be asking and parents should be asking and concerned people should be asking as this strategy develops. Because there are, I think, at least 5 different kinds of questions. The first is, what is the place of ethics in the development and implementation of the strategy? The very basic question. It's great to see the reference to ethics in the documents so far, but how will that be followed through all the way and weighted in the formation and the budgets and all those kinds of things? And in particular, I would look for 3 myths to be exploded and not present in the strategy. The first is that ethics and innovation are somehow alternatives and in tension with each other. I think, as we've heard from a number of people, that's not the case. And actually, this will go further if it's more ethically based. The second myth is that the ethics is done when the rhetoric is right. That's clearly not the case from many, many examples. It actually needs to be worked through into the granular detail, as Roger was saying earlier, in many different fields. And myth 3, I think the most dangerous of all, is that ethics can be adequate without any external and independent scrutiny. And I think when I hear that myth, whether it's from some sections of government or from big tech, my alarm bells ring hugely, really. I think human nature is that independent scrutiny is needed. So the rhetoric needs to be right. Secondly, is there an adequate vision of the potential of AI for the good of all? And that goes back to what Roger was saying at the beginning and what Andrew was saying as well, about having clear goals in mind, about the potential for good, which is absolutely enormous, as many people have said. But there is a whole area of ethics in power and potential in terms of how it will flow to the benefit of everybody, not just for a few. How do we weigh up what the right things to do are, the priorities that somebody said earlier? So that's a key set of questions. The third question are the ethics of consistency. We don't need to invent new ethics and values as a society, largely. The technology doesn't require that. What it does require is consistency with our wider understanding as a society. So 2 current debates on bias in algorithmic decision-making. We have an understanding of fairness. We need to make sure that is translated into the new technical applications. The second has been referred to already, online safety for children and the vulnerable, and how do we read across our valuing of children into the new technologies. There are gaps at the moment, and they need to be addressed, I think, in this strategy. The fourth set of questions are the ethics of consequences. How will our society continue to debate the ethical consequences of new technologies, both direct and indirect? Not every ethical question about AI is about its application. A lot is about its consequences. AI is recognized widely as a disruptive technology, but that's not actually present at the moment in the press notices about the new strategy. A good example of that will be the impact of AI on work, both the likely impact on the quantity of work available and also the kinds of jobs which are available and how the rights of those who do them are protected. And finally, what are the consequences of artificial intelligence and its deployment for our humanity? And again, several speakers, particularly Maria, have touched on that. Artificial intelligence and its deployment raises some existential questions, and it's essential to engage a wide cross-section of the public, but also the arts and the humanities, as well as the sciences and the social sciences. The risks and the benefits of what this is doing to us as people will need to be weighed carefully. The potential increase of loneliness and isolation, the effects on the motivation and ambition of the young. So 5 key ethical questions that I hope the strategy will be tested against.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I'm not going to let you just get away with raising the questions, though. I think we need an answer or two here. I mean, it's very interesting because obviously you've sat on the board of the CDEI since its inception, and Roger was talking about some fairly nitty-gritty type mechanisms for seeing if systems comply with ethical principles and maybe regulation as well, because we got onto that. I mean, the question in my mind, you've got some pretty high-level questions there in terms of impact on humanity, impact on the future of work, and so on. I mean, is there the likelihood in the short term that there is an impact assessment mechanism that could really be able to tackle the issues that you've raised in any meaningful way, or do we just have to go on gut feel?
No, I don't think we have to go on gut feel, but I think as I've reflected on this, the subject of the deployment of artificial intelligence is now so enormous and multifaceted. It affects, in a way, the whole of our society and will do for the coming decades. And therefore, it's unrealistic to expect any one unit within government or government itself to engage fully with the questions. Rather, as Maria was saying earlier, we need a broader education of wider communities, particularly local councils. If AI is to be deployed in local government, then we need to pay attention, as it is being done, we need to pay attention to the formation of local councillors in the scrutiny of all of this. So I think I favour a universal approach, but I very, very much support what Roger was saying in terms of the CDI's discovery, that it's in the granularity and particularity of each discipline and sector that the right answers and governance will be found, often through the application of that consistency principle.
We're not even that drawn together in government, are we? I mean, the amount of oversight centrally in compliance terms, and maybe in policy terms, but in compliance terms, there isn't a very tight ship being run, is there?
No, there isn't. And I think with a very rapidly developing technology, there has been for some years an accelerating risk that the deployment of the technology would outstrip the capacity to scrutinize it and even understand it. And therefore the work of education and engagement is hugely important and significant, and I hope will be a major strand in the strategy.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got some great questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask our parliamentarians, Lord Jandrin, Lord Holmes, Lord Errol, whether they might have a question first. Yes, Robin.
I was fascinated by all those presentations, and thank you all for some really interesting, thought-provoking ones. If I could go back to the Bishop, and because I think you're talking at a plane which I certainly begin to understand, the kind of template, if you like, that you are thinking about. Could you expand a little on your own thinking about how you move from your, if I could put it, ethical template into looking at the kind of parliamentary activity that government and parliament should be looking at to answer some of these really fundamental questions? In other words, how do you move on to stage 2?
Thank you, Robin. I think we're about to have that put to the test in Parliament through the online safety debates, really. And I think one of the features I reflect on of this APPG is that, while there's been fantastic interest from beyond Parliament, it's been a continual challenge to engage parliamentarians. And I think we need to up our game, particularly in the debate around online safety, to really show the relevance of asking these fundamental ethical questions and giving people the confidence to do that. Sometimes when we're dealing with new technologies, we lack confidence. We think it's a different ethical world. Actually, it's the same ethical world, but we need to apply those questions very strongly to the new technologies.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And Justin.
Yes, hello, Tim. Thank you. So I'm a head of strategy at a boutique strategy consulting firm, and have recently undertaken some economic modeling that shows that the impact of AI on company revenues will be over £1.2 trillion by 2030. I'm also a practitioner and lead a little spin out called Expert AI that uses augmented vision. My question is for Roger, following on from his suggestions for objectives that the public would like to see. And I just feel that there should be a little bit more focus on economic objectives, such as potentially the impact on growth in GDP over the next decade, or the impact on jobs, the positive impact on jobs or inward investments, in order to help shape business strategy. Of course, if we can see that growth, then that has the complementary benefit of being able to see greater demand in jobs as well. And so if we have that focus on ensuring that part of the good will be a stronger economy, then I think that will help focus minds.
Thank you very much indeed, Justin. Roger.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, the points I'd make is, first of all, I mean, I wasn't specifically addressing some of the aspects of the strategy that will support economic growth, particularly skills development, investment, and R&D. But I totally agree with you. The points the one thing I'd say though in response is that the ways in which government can drive economic growth is in those ways. I completely agree with what Stephen said, that doing this well, the reason why the pharmaceutical industry is now worth trillions and trillions of dollars is because it is regulated to a degree that its products work. They make people better. And prior to that, you've got pills of questionable value. Getting the regulation and the governance of this right is essential for it to produce economic growth. And that seems to be one of the sweet spots for the UK is to focus on that. So I don't disagree at all that should be a clear focus of the policy. But I think firstly that the things I was talking about, to my mind, contribute to it in two ways. Firstly, by ensuring that the way we use it is beneficial. And secondly, that there is and just to be clear, when I talk about these things such as, a better energy grid or, smarter access to justice or whatever it might be, these are things that government is never going to be able to do on its own. Yep, it's going to have to draw on industry, and it's got to find responsible and trustworthy ways to do this in order to deliver these benefits. So there's a direct economic benefit there. And lastly, the task of making sure things work well is a value generating activity. It is not a burden, as it were. Can I just make? I want to make one final point. I just want to come back on the discussion between you and Stephen about the big impact stuff, because I think one thing to say about this is when we talk about understanding, auditing or knowing how systems work, a lot of the time the focus is on micro issues. But when we want to know about things like online safety and what's the impact of, say, recommender systems on radicalization or young people's mental health, this requires us to understand really complicated systems affecting quite subtle things about individual human beings. And there is a huge issue there to work out how we do this in a way that is trusted by everybody, that is not seen as sort of controlling and manipulating, but which gives us a proper understanding of what's going on here. So these are significant challenges. They are hugely value generating, but I totally endorse the view that this is a massive opportunity for economic growth for this country.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. And I've now got Ian Potter, if we can bring him in this time.
Oh, thank you very much. My apologies, I didn't have access just now, but I was very struck by all of the inputs, but particularly Maria's about children. And my question is that in thinking about a national strategy on AI, do you think about it starting with schools and children learning about AI in terms of the future, or does the strategy end with the implications for schools and therefore what that might mean for schools. Through which end of the lens should the strategy be structured?
Maria.
Thank you so much, Jan. I think that's an excellent question. Is like, what's the role of the schools as providing most of the education and development for children? I would say that first and foremost, we need to understand the impact on children, and not just the negative impact, but also the positive impact, how AI can contribute and aid to children's development and harmonious development and education. And to do this, I think we need to do much more research. You know, as it stands, through the work I've been doing on AI for children, identified a handful of research groups around the world to actually research on the impact on AI-powered solution like robots and toy on children. So we need to understand a little bit more of what does it mean for children to interact with those tools. But in parallel, we can decide together what's the roles of the schools going forward. And we all know that the education process, the education system is in need for a big overhaul, and it's being put under strain as many other sectors in our life with the emergence of AI. So I think we can do things in parallel, decide what do we want to start doing as part of the schools. Do you want to train teachers and carers, or do you want to look much more proactively in including AI into curriculum, knowing that AI is part of a technology stack, and no one will be able to understand AI, especially children, if they are not put in a context of the other technologies that now being used. So I think more likely that we can go on both avenues, but if I was to choose one, I would say we need to understand the implication, and very much link it to the online harms. I think the reasons that we can't necessarily make some very decisive action is that we don't have the relevant data of the research that will direct it in the direction or another.
Maria, thank you very much. And then we're on to Professor Michael Thomas.
Thanks to all the speakers for an excellent presentation. My question is also from Maria, and it's in the context of AI in education. One of the possible innovations of using AI in education is to create adaptive learning environments and cognitive tutors. So online environments where children can learn, and AI is being used to tailor the learning environment to the specific profile of the children. So there seems to be great potential in the personalization of learning, but a lot of the best tools there are commercially developed. So my question is really about how one ring fences the kind of data that's collected about children and their performance profiles that can optimize adaptive learning without the risks of sharing those data more widely.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to ask Tabitha, actually, if she's got a view on that before I go to Maria, because obviously this is a big issue. I mean, I've been involved with the Institute for Ethical AI in Education, and that's been very much about appropriate use of AI in a way that is not only privacy protecting, but beneficial for learners and so on, and trying to create an ethical framework has been one of the goals of the Institute. But there are some big issues there, and I wondered if you'd encountered those in your travels, Tabitha.
I have actually. I've started thinking through this, and was invited last week or the week before to a workshop with Lego, where they had worked with Britain Thinks to look at what are the real risks around young people and technology. And one of the things that I found so interesting was echoes a lot of what Maria said, which was that the biggest risk is not them not having it at all. So it's actually the gap that we have created, and we've seen really starkly in the pandemic, is that actually we're at real risk that only the wealthy kids get the artificial intelligence, and kids that can't afford it will actually fall behind. And so in both arguing how we make sure this is done responsibly, ethically, and so on, we have to remember that also this is happening. This is happening. This is the journey that people are going, that the world is going on. And so it's a very frustrating answer for me to give, but I think that the only way to look at this is to think of I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could think of all solutions kids first? But ultimately, that is going to take a lot of a shift in the way we think about technology. But we should be thinking about it from the beginning.
Yes, Maria.
Thank you so much, Tabitha. I wholeheartedly agree that I think it's a better tagline if you say build your AI with your child in mind than trying to build ethical and responsible AI. So yeah,
I like that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael, for the question. I think you just pointed out that I missed mentioning the great work that ICO in partnership with Five Rights Foundation have done to release the first ever age-appropriate design, a code of practice for online services, which is in fact not a new law altogether, but it's an explanation of how GDPR applies in the context of children. And if you look at the 15 standards that are part of this code that provides protection to allow the children to learn necessary playing online, there are some of those principles and standards actually look at data minimization, data sharing, geolocation, profiling. I think from the UK perspective, having this world first regulation that applies to the children's data, it's a very handful resource to actually go and explore a little bit more in a safe manner. And I think I feel a bit safer being in the UK and for our children, because obviously we talk so much about ethical AI now with the work that ICO has been doing. I think we can afford, as Tabitha say, to start experimenting with how do we use AI in the context of education? How do we build responsible AI-driven toys? How do we make sure that we use children's data is in a way that enhances their development and recognizes that specific development needs? So I think that there's a lot to build of, but we also need a little bit more resources to go to the next level.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria. And now I've got Dr. Zeynep Engin, who's going to ask a question.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. Well, my question was about actually, we are discussing quite a lot about responding to the problems that the AI is generating, like fairness, transparency, accountability type of issues. And but I was thinking, and also we are focusing more on the sector. So my question is actually around the AI strategy, around the governance function itself. How do we incorporate algorithms in critical decision-making processes, thinking about really future of democratic values, maybe the mechanisms that we use to deliver them. How does the rules of law, I mean, accountability, consensus orientedness, participation will look like or should look like in the future, and how we can be more proactively prepared for those types of questions, and also how should we redesign our mechanisms. Currently it's bureaucracies, institutions and networks, people, but given that algorithms are coming into play to help us with all these sort of decision-making processes, how do we incorporate that in that process? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll send you my private members bill very shortly, which may help to elucidate some of that, Zeynep. But Andrew, I think this is very much an Ada Lovelace type question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it gets to a deeper question of what we mean by accountability to begin with. You know, when we think of the definitions out there, I think there's one that really comes to mind from Mark Bovens, who describes a relationship between an actor and a forum, in which the actor is obliged to explain, justify their conduct, and the forum can pose questions and pass judgment and give consequences upon that actor's actions. And right now, that doesn't really exist. If you use that definition and come to any type of AI, that doesn't really exist. There are oftentimes very unclear actors, very unclear forums, very few consequences, and very few accountability mechanisms that we can use today. When I think about what needs to happen going forward, one point is proximity. We need to increase more proximity between the development of AI systems and the types of problems they're seeking to address. AI as a technology is meant to be general purpose. It's meant to be something that can easily serve a variety of different customers at scale. And that is an inherent challenge that I think we're coming to reckon with in a variety of high stakes settings. So I think one place you can start is just initial disclosure and transparency of the types of systems that are out there. Cities like Helsinki and Amsterdam, for example, are using a transparency registry system, which I think is a very exciting one that I know parts of the UK government are considering adopting, just listing out what kinds of systems are in use, what their intended uses are, what data they're trained on, a variety of different mechanisms, just so that we know what's out there. There's a variety of other mechanisms, I think, like impact assessments that we've talked about, or other forms of data governance mechanisms, but those are still very nascent and not widely adopted. So while I appreciate there's a lot of worry that those kinds of assessments, they're modes of deliberation, they slow things down, and that is seen as a sort of in conflict at times with innovation and this notion of speeding things up. It's essential that we find that balance. Right now, things are so out of balance at this point in time. I think we need to find a right balance between accountability measures that increase accountability and retaining that level of innovation that we find healthy and productive for our economic growth in this country.
Although you might find yourself in a bit of an argument with Stephen if you're not careful, Andrew, as you realise, I expect. Jim, now what do you make of all this aspect? I mean, the question of regulation, the question of innovation, the question that's just been posed in terms of, in a sense, being able to understand enough about the governance of the use of AI within particular sectors and so on. I mean, clearly, increasingly, and I've no doubt already, AstraZeneca is very heavily involved, particularly in terms of identification of new vaccines and so on. What approach are you taking to this?
Yeah, I think in brief, to sort of stay as aware as possible and collaborate as much as possible. So we've seen things emerging over time, right? The sort of talk of the town at the moment is emerging EU regulation or proposals on AI, for example. And actually, that will affect people all over the globe because it includes organizations that then deploy AI solutions for use in the European Union. And I'm sure other parts of the world will come online with this at different times as well. So our approach has really been to, well, firstly, to get ahead of the game. So if you Google AstraZeneca and ethical AI, you'll find our .com webpage with our 5 ethical principles. That was last year. And then this year, we're putting governance in place to try and understand how do we live up to those, you know, in the future, assuming we could be audited on that and people could come into the company and say, well, how are you using AI? Show us. How are you making sure that the benefits outweigh the risks, to coin a phrase? So yeah, we're trying to be as open as possible. We have data policy specialists working to sort of track these developments around the world. But then I think what's really critical is, so I would definitely reinforce that idea, understanding within a domain, what's important for how AI is applied in healthcare and life sciences, or specifically pharmaceuticals, if you like. But then to sort of really think about what is high, low, medium risk. There are certain ways in which we use AI to hunt for patterns in data, which doesn't have a particularly direct impact on people's health, for example. And then clearly there's applications that can and will have more of a direct impact on people's health. So I think it's really important to think about it as risk strata, as well as the other dimensions.
Very interesting. So in a sense, your practical governance, your governance within the business is actually anticipating legislation to some degree or regulation to some degree.
We've tried to stay ahead, yes, as much as we can, so that, you know, we sort of knew this was coming. We didn't know which part of the world we'd hear it from first, but being a global company, we knew it would affect us one way or the other. So yes, we've tried to stay ahead as much as we can, hopefully not second guess, but just sort of get aligned ahead of time, so to speak.
Well, that leads very neatly into Catherine Holden. Catherine.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone on the panel for their brilliant contributions so far. My question is, we've briefly sort of discussed the European Commission's recent legislative proposal on AI. I'd be really interested to get the panel's thoughts on this proposal, but also where the UK should align and equally where we should be diverging as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Now, good. I think, Roger, we might come to you on that. just to put you in the hot seat, you know.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think,
you know the government hangs on your every word.
yeah, I was going to say, I'm obviously not speaking for the government in the comments, but I'll give you my sense of it, which I think is not hugely different from certainly where a lot of people in this country are thinking, which is, firstly, this notion of creating overarching horizontal regulation is, I'm going to be quite blunt about it. I think it's a sort of driven by a desire to be first in the world and to get there first. I don't think it's very well thought through. You know, just to give you an example, you know, GDPR is hailed within the EU as being a huge success, but we've got to recognize it is actually, you know, already we are finding that it has, you know, its ability to cope with where we are now. The concepts like anonymization are simply proving impossible to operate with. The notion of automated decision making is really struggling to make sense in the world that we're moving into. There's real risks about trying to write into law principles. I'll give you another example. I find this idea of the mechanism of high risk technologies being something that a regulator defines. It seems to me that is not an expert consideration. It is a democratic consideration, and it's also extremely difficult to do. And to give one example, you know, when YouTube announced it was going to create a recommendation system for finding the video you're most likely to want to watch next, it would not strike anybody at the time as being, well, that's a high risk application, we must definitely do something about that. And of course now we are all extremely concerned about how recommendation systems for online content, in fact, can be extremely harmful to people. So I am very worried about it in terms of its attempt to try to establish, you know, from, you know, overarching principles that will drive forward regulation across the whole economy. I also think there's a terrible mistake in trying to regulate AI. You know, we want to regulate things in the world like sort of healthcare treatments that are, you know, and distinguish between things that we do need to regulate, like a healthcare treatment, and things that we may not need to regulate, and that the people who need to do that need to regulate healthcare, they need to regulate finance, they don't need to regulate AI, they need to know how is the AI affecting how finance operates or how healthcare operates, and is it operating to the standards we want. So I don't much care for the EU approach. The one thing I would point out though is I think the EU, I think rather you know, what's not great is the EU has made quite good progress on trying to think about how data can be shared, made much more available to drive innovation, discovery, and research. And I think they're a bit ahead of us on that one. And I think that is something we need to really focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. And Tabitha, do you have a view at this stage of the EU proposals, and or your members, I should say, of the council? Is there a sort of common view, or is it too early?
Too early for a common view. I think what the people that I have informally discussed with is everyone was quite excited about the proposal. You know, it felt like the rubber was really hitting the road, and that's a good feeling. But as Roger said, trying to figure out like how to define what high risk means is going to be very, very difficult, but also interestingly quite technically difficult. And I think that where I got excited, and I was talking with Adrian Weller at the Turing on, is there's a real opportunity for the UK to lead here, not just in standards, but in how technically we can be doing the work that the regulations suggest should be, you know, that AI systems should be capable of, because we're quite a far away from some of the things they've described. And that's cool. Like, that's a really good opportunity for the UK economy. In Catherine's question about like where we should diverge, I think there's a lot of lessons from GDPR in terms of the trade-offs between valuable consumer protection and then a thriving innovation ecosystem. One of the risks that we saw was that GDPR actually favors the incumbents. The other risk we saw was that GDPR was only really understandable to the people that were implementing it, not the people who were benefiting from it. So, you know, no one I spoke to outside of the industry or the ecosystem understood what rights they'd just received. So I think there's a huge piece around public engagement that needs to happen in order for the regulation to actually be used. You know, a right to be forgotten. Who knew they had that? And so I think there's some exciting opportunities for the UK to just to kind of pip bits of this to the mark and follow, you know, where we can be aligned.
That's quite interesting. So you think we could be kind of at the forefront of risk assessment or classification for AI?
I really do.
Develop a specialism in that area.
Exactly. We are, you know, as a country, the forefront of assurance, and the forefront of, you know, things get trademarks and stamping, and, you know, I think there's a real history and a pedigree that the UK could have, and they could lead here for sure.
I think that's great. We all need to read chapter 9 of the feasibility study, Roger.
Yes.
The Council of Europe feasibility study, because I think that heralds quite a bit of this.
The product roadmap, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Stephen, I think, I think from your facial expression, you'd like to just comment on some of what you've heard here. Are we going to have a rebellion on the board of the CDEI?
No, actually, I agree with Roger's perspective on Europe. So no, I don't think so. But I do think one of the things I observed from the European approach is that there has been a robust willingness to stand up to the big tech companies and to pilot a course which is, as it were, in the best interests of the population rather than of big tech. And that willingness to take on big tech is, I hope, something the UK government will imitate in the European approach, because I think allowing the big tech companies to moderate themselves is not a fruitful approach in the long term. So whatever we emerge with in detail, I hope there'll be a parallel robustness and courage and willingness to take that independent view.
Thank you very much. And then I think probably, Désirée, our final question comes from Tony McGurk.
Thank you very much for letting me ask a question. I've been in IT now for over 40 years, and I believe we're leading the way in AI, especially my own company. We're doing AI in eco and behavioural change. I'm interested in how do we ensure that any AI implemented can demonstrate a level of transparency. Algorithmic systems, are hard to control, monitor, and correct, and we need to remember that algorithmic conclusions are probabilities and not infallible. And the adage of garbage in, garbage out is as relevant today as when I started back in IT 40 years ago.
Thank you very much indeed. Maria, I know you have a vast amount of technical knowledge. You've talked about a subject close to your heart so far today, but you have to advise quite a bit about this kind of area. I just wondered if you'd like to come in on this.
Thank you so much. I think, first of all, I wanted to comment something on the AI regulation first, and the fact that this is a risk-based approach that is probably the most common sense. Let's make sure that we understand which application will produce the most dangerous and unintended consequence and act upon this. And if you look at what ICO is doing, they are producing, in fact, an AI risk toolkit that is very much aligned with the same approach. Let's look at how do we understand what we have been preaching so far, the dark side of AI, the risk, and we start finding the right mitigating alternatives for this. But I think it's really important to understand that AI is much more than a technology. And then one of the conversation we kept on having is that we need to be moving from framing AI as a general purpose technology and framing AI as a large technology system. And I think there are many academics out there that already use this definition of framing of AI as AI, the technology plus its context. There's no way we can regulate, govern, use AI if we don't understand how this adaptive new technology is changing not only our behavior, but how we operate with one another. And by doing this, reframing the term AI and being able to understand this ripple effect, then we will understand how to do a better job when we approach its governance, including regulating, including what we regulate as a hard rule and what we allow organizations to do a bit of a self-regulation information and manage those or adhering to some norms by themselves. And the only way to go ahead is to understand ultimately that the way we design technology is very much under the mantra, can we do it? It's how Silicon Valley has become who they are. But ultimately, what we need to be doing all collectively is change this from can we do it into should we do it? And if we have this different vision, then everyone in the industry, from data scientists all the way to ethicists and all the way to users, will have a different understanding of this technology and what is being done. And that's the big difference in between AI and all the other technologies. Is not just a technology, is the context it operates in.
Splendid. And of course, that's a wonderful quote. That's from Margaret Bowden, of course, who at our very inception, I think was one of our very earliest speakers.
I remember, sorry.
No, she's terrific. Anybody else want to grapple with the aspect of ensuring that any AI implemented? I mean, the answer I suspect that you would give, Maria, is you don't have the full range of controls and governance unless it's medium and higher risk. You have to calibrate the degree of governance by reference to the degree of risk.
True. It's absolutely, and the challenge we have is that risk management and technology risk, it's a domain that's very little understood outside financial services, and that's why this regulation is so needed, because outside financial services, realistically, if you look at public services or any other domain, risk management and technology risk is a new domain. And what that means is that when we start looking to develop those controls associated with AI risk, we need to develop operational capability. And that means what? Complexity and cost. So that's something that a lot of, the technologies in the AI space, they understand that this complexity is coming. When we develop AI, it's going to be much more than, the data set and the algorithms and the interface. Is going to be a complex governance layer. That means compliance in a corner with a bit of self-enforced rules that are part of the organization. Now, so the right right mitigation activities that can be a combination between people, roles, and new processes and new ways of doing things. And that's something that we rarely discuss, this complex ecosystem of AI that will trigger us to operate quite differently. And we can't escape this. We want AI at scale that comes with this tag attached. AI at scale with benefits maximize and minimize the risk. It's coming at the package.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell me what, in 5 years' time, with the implementation of an AI strategy, good would look like in 2 sentences. Nothing too tricky here. But first of all, I'm going to, before we close, I hope everybody thinks we've had a good discussion, because certainly I must admit, I think it's been great hearing from our panel today. But I just wanted to emphasize that we can only do this, we can only do it if we're properly resourced as an all-party group. And in order to keep on delivering what we do, we have to have members, we have to have people who sign up to the all-party group. We don't have funding from Parliament or government or whatever. I suppose in a sense you could call us informally crowdsourced, but I do hope that people will not resist any invitation from Birgitte and Désirée to join up and become, if you like, funding members of the all-party group, because the more you help us, the better meetings, the more reports we can do, the more we can input into the national AI strategy. I mean, AI this year, let's face it, we've got the defense AI strategy, we've had the integrated review, which has passages on AI. We've even as part of the defense command paper, there's a whole section on AI. Ollie, just to reassure you, defense is top of thinking in terms of lethal autonomous weapons and so on and so forth. Very important aspects of AI, and I hope that the strategy will not ignore that. So thank you very much. I'm going to go to Stephen first of all, and just to give us your idea of, in 5 years' time, what good would look like.
That the UK would lead the world in the safe and ethical deployment of AI technologies, and that we will have a much wider public awareness and public engagement with the issues.
Thank you. Jim?
Stole exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say the UK in the lead and the people of the UK wholeheartedly behind that.
Thank you very much. Andrew?
I suppose it would be having processes of identifying and defining harm and the potential benefits that we would like to see from all citizens in society, rather than a select few designing the systems.
Brilliant. Maria?
There will be no Molly Russells, but teenagers that will build robots and solve, environmental issues using AI. Go teens.
Tabitha?
I think this strategy will have been successful if in 5 years' time, we don't need another one. It's embedded into absolutely everything that is happening within government.
Oh, very sneaky. Yeah, I like that. And Roger?
We're using AI to improve healthcare, to have a better energy system, our transport system, personalized education. But more importantly, we are an exemplar to the world of how you can introduce these new technologies in a way where we understand what the risks are and we manage and mitigate those risks so that the public trust that this is beneficial to them.
Well, I think it's a demonstration of the quality of our panel that we've had such a fantastic set of answers there. Inspirational, actually. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all those who asked questions. I'm sorry not all of them have been answered, but I think we got through quite a few. Thank you to Birgitte, Désirée for setting up this fantastic meeting. And thank you to everybody. And I certainly feel much more informed about the way forward. And I think there's a huge amount of consensus, actually. And even internationally, where I think perhaps we should look for the commonalities rather than the differences. That might be a good approach. How about that for a change? Anyway, let's go for it. Thank you very much indeed, folks, and we'll see you, I hope, on a future occasion. Thank you.